Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we're jumping in again to chapter three, the second portion, so part two of two. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm excited to walk through the rest of the slides here with you from Frank Brother Mel. The next slide is industry growth. I'm going to grab my notes here. And so the whole idea is that, yeah, we're talking about knee replacements here, which is awesome. Uh, Such a hot and growing industry and growing product. So, this directly affects the intensity of rivalry of among competitors. So as the industry grows more quickly, there can be more and more competitors. And then when there's periods of high growth, consumer demand rate rises because there are more and more people that need this product, and price competition among the firm frequently decreases. So, because so many people need this, the supply is less than the demand. And so the example, as I said, is the knee replacement segment in medical products. And so with the baby boomer generation now getting older, this is a really hot product, and only a few organizations know how to produce these things. So during periods of negative growth, rivalry can be really fierce. And maybe that's why the construction industry can be fierce, is that while there's always, people building buildings and things like that, but it's not like a huge, in the United States, like a huge booming industry. In certain cities, yeah, maybe, and that's why maybe they have joint ventures in a particular city in the construction industry for sure. Um, but then when there's negative growth, also rivals can only gain at the expense of one another, right? Because there's like only a few clients and customers, and everybody's fighting over them. So the organizations will start to give price discounts, frequent with product releases with minor modifications to make it like exciting promotional campaigns, and there could be retaliation between the organizations, and so yeah, you want to be in an industry that has high growth, a much more fun and profitable place to be. So, talking now about strategic commitments, because these are firm decisions, the decisions that firms make, and they can be very costly and long term and difficult to reverse, right? So, the CEOs want to make sure that they're making the right decision. So, there are firm decisions versus tactical decisions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But now we're talking about these decisions made for the whole entire firm. And these can stem from large fixed cost requirements like building a gigafactory, or non-economic considerations, right? Things that when we have COVID or something like this, we need to make decisions that will affect us for the next couple of years. So it affects the intensity of rivalry among the competitors. So again, just being aware that we're talking about long-term decisions. Something else we need to consider when looking at industries are exit barriers. How easily can an organization leave the industry or file bankruptcy or get out? Which you think for most organizations it's probably decently simple, but not necessarily. There can be some obstacles that determine how easily a firm can leave, and these are economic and social factors. There's some fixed costs that must be paid off. Maybe they bought a building somewhere and they need to sell that. So that could take some time. But the companies that have the highest or most extensive barrier to exit are employee health care and retirement benefits. So the whole idea that if you start a healthcare company like Anthem or Aetna, you can't just tomorrow say, okay, we're shutting down, because there are people who have signed a contract for you for the next year or multiple years. Or maybe you've signed contracts with organizations to provide healthcare for their employees. And so the exit barrier is quite high. And retirement benefits too, right? A 401(k), an organization that has agreed to provide those types of things, it would take a year or two to exit the industry. Um, Social factors, I think, is super interesting too when we look at like places like Detroit. Um, GM, for example, which is headquartered there, GM can't just like shut down or leave Detroit or consolidate their efforts in general because the whole city, for the most part, of Detroit depends on the automotive industry. So it's more of like a social thing in that they would really disappoint the people within the city. And there's a sixth force, as I said, I think a super interesting thing that we don't think sometimes pay attention to is a complement. So it adds value when used with the original product. And the great example they use here is Samsung and Google. So Google provides the Android operating system, and they've partnered with Samsung, right? And so they're complements of each other. So they can increase demand for the primary product. With Samsung and Google, what is the primary product? Well, okay, I guess in this instance, they're thinking of Samsung phones as the primary product. It enhances the profit potential for the whole industry and the firm. So, so there's cooperation among competitors sometimes to achieve a strategic objective because while Google still makes their own phones, so they could be a competitor to Samsung, their their main product is Android, and so they are a complement to Samsung. As you can see, it can get complicated. So here are some entry choices. When, how, what, where, and who to enter a market. And so the example they give in the book is about Circuit City and how when, they were like a Best Buy, so they used to sell electronics and they weren't doing this very well because people were buying things online. They decided to shut down slowly, but they were so good at big box models and they saw that people were still going to to lots to buy cars. So they entered the car industry. So Circuit City moved industries and became CarMax. Um, and so, yeah, and so, when when should you enter a market? The stage of the industry, the life cycle, the order of entry. How should you enter the market? What type of entry, right? Do you want to scale? You want to commit? Um, you want a product or a service? What type of business model do you have? Where? Product positioning, pricing strategy, potential partners. Who? Identifying the players, the incumbents, the entrants, etc. So lots of decisions to be made when creating a new organization with new product. And then we have industry dynamics here. This is learning outcome 7, so we're almost done with this chapter. A weakness of other models is that they are static, and it's like a point in time snapshot. But industry dynamics talk about the changing speed of an industry moving forward or the rate of innovation. And so can be super helpful because this can capture structural changes in the industry. And we see this again and again in the airline industry. Again, there are mergers all the time, and how we need to stay abreast of what is happening and what is changing in an industry. There can be industry convergence, as I briefly mentioned in the learning outcomes, when different somewhat unrelated industries begin to satisfy the same customer need. And again, these are technological advances. And so the example that they give here is media industries. And so like telecom, that televisions became streaming devices, and then we have newspapers, magazines, TVs, movies. They all are a source of entertainment, and so they've all become under one. Time Warner is a big umbrella of all these different media companies. Netflix, you can say too, even though that's movies, but sometimes now TV. Um, Apple Music, right, is podcasts and learning. So, print media obviously will be obsolete within a number of years, most likely. And then strategic groups. So, this is a set of companies where they pursue a similar strategy and they're in the same industry. So, if you remember that chart from the beginning of the section, it had three little circles, and within an industry, there can be an actual separate group. And we're going to talk a lot about now low-cost carriers versus uh, other airline industries that their business model is not low cost. So they cluster into different groups, and it's based on strategic dimensions. So how to create a strategic group model. So first, identify the important strategic dimensions. Is it technology? Is it something else? You need to create a horizontal and a vertical axis. And they're not a highly correlated group, so they don't have like a lot of overlap. You graph the firms in the strategic group, each firm's market share indicated by the size of the bubble. So let's look at the airline industry here. You can see the low cost, point to point, and then differentiated hub and spoke. So like Delta has their hub in Atlanta. United Airlines has a hub here in Los Angeles. They have a couple of different hubs, but those are the bigger ones. American Airlines, Philadelphia is one of their major hubs. So Cincinnati. So as you can see, we're looking at the routes from low to high routes, and then the cost structure, right, is low here because it's a low cost area, and that there's a mobility barrier here. So there's a difference, right? So they're not correlated. They're really in their own worlds of a strategic group. There's some insights from the strategic group mapping. So we can see that competitive rivalry is strongest amongst the firms within the same strategic group. So, like Southwest doesn't really look to compete all that much with United Airlines. They're looking to compete with Spirit. External forces, environment affects the strategic groups differently. So, like, right, if the economy tanks, um, low-cost airlines will be less affected because people can still pay for those things, while the other airlines would be more affected. The five competitive forces affect strategic groups differently, like about suppliers and buyers, like who is buying these things and who's supplying the information, supplying the product to them, right? And then some strategic groups are more profitable than others, and definitely in low cost airline industry, they are definitely often more profitable, for better or for worse, than the traditional airlines. And then we have mobility barriers. So that line that separated the two, this restricts movement between the two strategic groups. So that means that the industry-specific factors that separate one group from another, so you can very clearly see that they're different. And it's based on hard to reverse investments. So these, again, strategic commitments, different from task commitments. So people at these C-level organizations, and C-level and within these organizations have made a decision to be within the strategic group or not. And then what happens what are the dynamics in these strategic groups is our last slide for today. Um, there's firm positioning, how they, talk to each other or connect with each other. They have different, slightly different strategies. Um, and they can also, all these things can change over time. A strategic group can split into two subgroups. Like here, ultra low cost airlines, Frontier, Allegiant, Spirit, split from low cost airlines, JetBlue, Southwest, and Alaska. True. And so, for example, here in 2022, Frontier bid to acquire Spirit, right? So Frontier and Spirit wanted to join forces, but they are always, like any organization, anyone's life is constantly changing. Okay, good. Thank you so much for joining me here with chapter 3. I hope that that was helpful. Just to review the learning outcomes, because we have a few minutes in this video. We talked about the pestle analysis way back when. We differentiated the roles of firm effects and industry effects, right? So what the decisions are that are made of a firm are 55% influential on the organization, but the organization is dependent 25% on what is happening in the total industry, right? That's a quarter. And so that's why we spend a lot of time working with Michael Porter and understanding what exactly is happening in the industry. So we talked about these five forces, buyers, suppliers, how competitive industry structure shapes rivalry, right? Are there organizations that are more or less have more and less rivalry, right? Especially when the industry is growing, there can be less rivalry because there's opportunity for everyone. If the industry is in decline, um, then there's a lot of anxiety and um, yeah, I'm trying to think of an industry that's in decline. Yeah, I'd say like lacrosse sticks. I don't know why they come to mind, but right, not a ton of people play lacrosse. So, there are like just like two or three brands out there, and there's a lot of rivalry amongst those things. Um, Describe the strategic role of complements, right? And so how how you can work with your complement, creating positive sum. So Google with Android and Samsung work together. The five choices required for market entry, like who, what, where, when, how you want to enter the market, the role of industry dynamics and how it's always changing and they converge and get bigger. And so this all affects, right, the an organization. When we look at LMU, like it's always changing, right? For the most part, USC and UCLA are the same, but we see a lot of change now with small liberal arts colleges. Like, I went to Villanova and we just merged with Cabrini College, which was the school down the street. It was a small liberal arts college. And so we would have never predicted that 20, 30 years ago when I graduated. And the last thing is generating a strategic group model to reveal performance differences between clusters. So you will have competitors, but then you'll also have within an industry, but then you'll also have maybe clusters of people who are more closely of a competitor than others. So again, thank you so much for joining me here for chapter 3. I look forward to seeing you in chapter 4.